Alright, welcome back to the channel. This is a build series on a drag car on a Traxxas platform. So in a previous video we installed the front end off of a Bandit onto a slash chassis as well as the rear end. We have not done the hexes or the rear wheels. That's for a later time. But for now, what we're going to do next is we're actually going to do the shocks. Now, these are the stock shocks or factory shocks that come with most two-wheel drive vehicles that Traxxas sell 1/10 scale. For example, Slash, Bandit, as well as the Rustler. The rears are the longer ones, the short ones are the fronts. And that's usually the case in most vehicles. The fronts tend to be shorter than the rear. Now, because this is a drag car, we're going to keep the front shocks the same. I was actually debating whether or not to go with the GTR shocks for the front, but I don't really need them because I'm not going to be going over massive bumps or anything like that. So I'm just going to keep the factory front shocks, which are these, and I'm going to go into the installing process pretty soon. And again, I'm not going to be going over bumps, jumps, anything like that. So the front are going to do just fine. The only thing that I want is I want light shock oil. And the reason why I want light shock oil is because as soon as the car takes off, I want the arms to be as responsive as possible and drop as fast as possible. So I want them to, the car's going to be sitting like this. As soon as I take off, I want the arm to do that. That's the reason why. So you're sitting, takes off. And that's so that I can have some steering as I'm taking off, because this is going to want to lift off the front end. Now this is as much travel as you get with these, right? There's no shock over here, so notice you don't get much droop in the front Traxxas vehicles, and that really has to do with this link down here. That's the reason why. So this is the one that adjusts your toe in, toe out. That's the link that actually holds this from drooping any further. And it has to do with the position. It's positioned this way instead of this way, so it won't droop anymore. But again, light oil is all I want here. So for this, to be honest, it doesn't matter in the front if you are going to do the top or the bottom first. I'm going to do the bottom first just because, and I'm going to mount it on the very first hole, which is the inner hole. And the reason why is, again, I want that travel, and I also want more of the vertical force. That's for another video, so there's another video where you will be able to see what I mean by vertical force. But just a quick little recap. Generally, if you're going to be taking a lot of turns on high traction, you're going to want to move out. If you're not in high traction, or you don't need, for example, something like this, a drag car, you need more of the absorption up and down, so you're taking big jumps, you want to move them in. So you want the shocks to be more vertical. Again, more explanation in a different video. This one here we're just mounting. So we're just going to screw these back on. Again, we don't need the GTRs in the front, so we're just keeping the stock ones. All you need is light oil. Maybe a 20 weight will be good. You just need the front arms to be very responsive and as fast as possible. And that is why I'm keeping them. That is it. If you want to add preloads, that's fine. Drag car, to be honest, generally you want a lower rear, higher front end. So if you add more preloads, that's fine. Add more preloads. Just try it out. You really have to just test. And I know it's kind of annoying for some people, because some people, especially when you're new to the hobby, which is the purpose of these vehicles, if you're new to this, you almost want somebody to just tell you, do this and it will work. This and you will discover all the wonders in the world. But that's not the case. It's trial and error, really. But I'm telling you why I'm doing this. And again, go with really light oil, so this is responsive. Later on you can start adding preloads if it's not responsive enough. But you don't want to overdo it. You definitely want some oil in there, so don't take the oil out and then just have the spring, because then it's going to be bouncy. So the problem is, if the oil is way too light, as soon as this takes off, it's going to want to come up the front. Well, once it stabilizes, if the oil is not heavy enough, this is just going to be bouncing down the straightaway. You don't want that. So you still want an oil. You want an oil that's light enough to where it's really responsive, but still has enough viscosity to where it manages the springs. The other thing too, you can go with lighter springs, lighter oil, lighter springs. That's the front setup. So we're keeping the stock shocks. The rear though, we are definitely going with GTRs. So these are the GTRs. There is another video where I built this GTR, and yes, if you have not watched the other video, this spring is off of an E-Revo. The oil is actually really extremely thick oil. These are pretty hard springs, but it still allows for travel, right? Because the suspension has to work. But keep in mind that on funny cars, for example, the suspension is fixed. So I'm going with this because I don't want the vehicle to squat too much. Or at all, really. But you also want a little bit of travel here, just a little absorption, mainly so that the rear tires don't come off the ground and go onto the wheelie bar. But again, I'm going to experiment. So right now here on the preload, there isn't really much. I just screwed this down to where there's no more play here in the spring, so the spring isn't sliding back and forth. But one of the things in that video is that these are actually GTR shocks for the front, not the rear. So I decided not to go with the rear, and the reason why is because the fronts are shorter than the rear. So this would be the other side over here. I've removed it so you can see the difference in the length. We're going to go ahead and install this one, and I'm going to explain why I chose to use the front instead of the rear. Now, really quick, whenever you're installing shocks in the rear arms in the front, because they screw through the front, it doesn't matter if you do top or bottom. If you're doing the rear shocks, you want to do the bottom first, so do the lower. Again, it's a drag build, so I'm going to go into the inner hole. Now, notice the difference here on this little barrel there, right? The screw is going to go on the larger face. So I'm going to use the screw, and that's going to go here. The smaller face is going to go up against the arm. So again, this is a 2mm driver, and I cannot emphasize enough, buy quality tools. If you were doing this with cheap tools, you would be probably damaging the tool as well as damaging your screws, and there's very few things in RC that are worse than busting up the heads of your screws. I mean, that has got to be one of the most annoying things, I'll be honest. Especially the removal. You have to use an extractor, and sometimes you can manage with pliers, but again, just why bother? Just buy quality tools. All right, you may be able to tell that the car is sitting differently already, and that's because there's no shock over here. That's why it's leaning. But again, on this other side, you see the large surface, that's where the screw's going to go. Small surface, that's going to go up against the shock mount. So screw's going to go in here, and you want to line these up so that the screw goes in straight. You don't want the screw going in crooked. You can damage the plastic, that's why, and then if you hit a hard bump or something, it'll come out. Although, again, drag build, not really made for bumps, although sometimes you can. So even there, you may be able to tell that it's sitting differently. It's actually leaning this way, and that is because of this. So if you look at the arm with the stock shock actually comes down further. And that's the reason why I went with the fronts in the rear, because I don't want this. I want stiff rear suspension, but if I put stiff rear springs to compensate for the thicker oil, it's going to make the arm come down too far. I want to keep this as flat as possible. So here, that's about right. So that's the reason why I am not doing the rear shocks in the rear. and I chose to do the front in the rear. So this car is going to be running front shocks all around. The only difference is it will have the GTRs for the rear. And if you watch the other video, you will see the part number there. And I'm also going to be using E-Revo springs, which are thicker. They have a higher spring rate. So that being said, all I'm going to do is just replace this one with this shock, and I'm going to be set. So just to not make the video any longer, I'm just going to replace this one off camera. You already saw how I installed this one. The removal for this one over here is really going to be just the opposite. Here we installed arm first, shock tower last. To remove, you're going to remove shock tower first, arm last. And the reason why is to get to this screw with the arm on is a little tougher. You're going to be hitting the chassis with your hand or the driver. Whereas if you remove this one first, you're going to have plenty of room right there for the driver. That's the reason why. All right. Other than that, those are the shocks for the drag car. Follow-up video, you're going to see the other shock installed. Thank you very much for watching. Go ahead, like, dislike, subscribe, hit the bell. Be good. I'll see you in the next one.